So first of all, thank you for your patience as we have been waiting for others to join our event today. We are so excited to have you on the line with us. My name is Paige Graff, and I'm sort of the lead facilitator on the line today, but also joining us is Liz Rampe, our featured speaker, but also Suzanne Foxworth. Now, I do want to take a moment to welcome all of our participants from across the United States. We've got participants registered from 42 different states, DC, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Canada, South Africa, and even Morocco. So we've got people joining us in a sense from all around the world, and you are educators that work with the general public, students, library folks, museum folks. We are so happy to have you on the line today with us. So welcome to all of you. I also really want to take a special moment to welcome our featured speaker, Liz Rampe. Liz is an extremely busy individual. She's driving a rover on Mars. She's working with that Curiosity rover day in and day out, and she has a very busy schedule. So we are so glad that Liz is able to join us today. So we'll turn things over to her in just a moment. The last thing I'll mention is we do have periodic webinars that we run from time to time. So you can always check our webinar website to see what we might have coming up. So with that, again, my name is Paige Graff, and we are so glad to have all of you with us today, but we're all here for Liz. Liz, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Paige. About myself, I am from just outside of Denver, Colorado. I went to undergraduate school at Colgate University in upstate New York, where I majored in geology. From my undergrad, I went straight into a PhD program at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. That's where I first started studying Mars. I got my PhD there in 2011 in geology, then went to the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston to do a 3-year postdoc. From there, I was hired on as a contract scientist, and I worked as a contract scientist for about 3 years, and then I transitioned into the civil service. So I've been a civil servant at NASA for about 3.5 years now. So my research is about the mineralogy or the minerals that we find on the surface of Mars. And in particular, I'm really interested in the minerals that form from water-rock interactions, because these minerals that form in water can tell us a lot about the past aquatic environments on Mars. So they can tell us how saline the fluids were, what their pH was, how oxic the fluids were, and what their temperature was. So I study minerals on Mars in a few different ways, one of which is directly. So I work on the ChemIn instrument on the Mars Science Laboratory Curiosity rover and the deputy PI of that instrument. It's an X-ray diffractometer, and we can use those data to quantify minerals on the Martian surface. I also study Martian mineralogy a little indirectly, too. I synthesize minerals that we expect to find on the Martian surface in the laboratory, and I also study minerals in Mars analog environments. And this photo of me in the upper left is from the Collier Glacial Valley in the Three Sisters, just outside of Bend, Oregon. We think early Mars was cold and icy, sort of like this image here, and so this is a very good Mars analog environment. I'm also interested in how we can incorporate science into future human missions, and so I've been a part of a few human mission analog tests, and this photo on the right is of me back in 2012 when I was a crew on one of these missions. But today I'm going to give you a little more than an update on Curiosity. I'm going to give you an overview of the mission and what we've learned about Mars from Curiosity. And I'll give you a preview of the next NASA rover going to Mars. It's the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover. So let's start with the basics. I'm a geologist, but what is geology? So geology is the study of the Earth's physical structure and substance or composition, its history or how it's changed over time, and the processes that act on it. And some of these processes include geophysical processes like earthquakes or volcanic or igneous processes, or sedimentary processes like the transportation of grains by water and wind. And this is a photo of me down here next to a volcanic neck in Iceland. And so this is a where lava sort of chilled before it was erupted, forming these giant, lovely columnar basalts. So it's relatively straightforward to do geology on the surface of the Earth. You know, we can go in the field and make measurements, collect samples, bring them back to the lab, and do more measurements back in the lab. It's a little trickier to do geology on other planets, but there are ways around it. There are ways that we can do geology on other planets. So we can make observations from telescopes on Earth. We can make measurements from orbiters, landers, and rovers. We can study samples that are returned from other planetary bodies. We have not returned samples yet from Mars. We can study meteorites from other planetary bodies. We do have meteorites from Mars. And we can send people. And of course, we've only sent people to the moon, but we hope to send people to Mars one day. So then why are scientists so interested in Mars? Why do we explore it? Well, Mars has geologic features that are similar to Earth. So we think it has a fairly similar geologic history or geologic past. We know that water once flowed on the surface of Mars, and because life as we know it requires liquid water, we want to know if Mars could have once supported microbial life. And so was the Martian surface habitable to these microorganisms? So we talk a lot about habitability in planetary science. So what are the requirements for a habitable environment? Well, there are four main requirements. One is some sort of solvent. Life as we know it requires water. Life also needs some essential raw materials, and life as we know it needs carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, along with a variety of other trace elements. Life also needs favorable conditions. So, for example, water that isn't too saline. And life also needs some sorts of energy, so light or some sort of chemical energy. And so we look for the combination of all four of these requirements to identify habitable environments on other planets. There are quite a few differences between Mars and Earth, but one important difference, and one that we can take advantage of in our exploration of the Martian surface, is that Earth has plate tectonics. We all know that. Mars never had any plate tectonics, at least not as robust as Earth tectonism. And so on Earth, because of the plate tectonics, the very ancient crust has mostly been recycled, and so we can't study it. On Mars, because there was no plate tectonics, the crust that is 3 to 4 billion years old is still present on the surface, and we can study it today. So we can actually study the habitability of early Mars much more easily than we can study the habitability of early Earth. Okay, so we've been talking about water and that life needs water and that water once flowed on the surface of Mars. And so this is a question for all of you. How do we know that water once flowed on Mars? And this is a multiple choice question. Here are your choices. A, we see water on the surface today. B, surface features provide evidence of water that flowed across the surface. Or C, remote sensing instruments detect minerals on the surface that form from water. So please put your answer in the chat window.
And if you have any supporting information as well, that would be great. And before you even finished asking that question, we had B's and C's coming in. A lot of people saying B for sure. Let's see, we've got all three from one of our participants. A majority of folks are saying B and C, but there are a ton of Bs out there. And in terms of the supporting evidence, it looks like some folks are even saying that you can use images from Mars as well as information from other rovers, and that's great information that folks are finding in there. Somebody refers to the Phoenix spacecraft, stating that it found some water on the surface, and even including that all of the above and that both B and C have been supported. So there's things such as Curiosity ChemCam, things such as ice at the poles in terms of some of the answers that are coming in, even the photos that people may see, and someone even has mentioned gullies. So, you know, we've got quite a few people on the line out there, Liz, and we're getting, aside from these B's and C's, which seem to be the majority of what folks are saying, there's a lot of things that people are providing some details on, which is a great part of science out there. So anything stick out at you, Liz, and what would you say the answer is?
Yeah, so we've got a great and informed group on the line. It is actually all three. So everybody's right, or a lot of people are right that A, we do see water ice on the surface today. There is limited evidence for possible liquid water on the surface today, which I'll go into in a second. We also see ancient river and lake deposits. And we also see minerals that formed in liquid water, like clay minerals and salts that I'll talk more about too. So let's talk about water on the surface today. So of course, Mars is dry and cold. Most of its water is locked up in the polar caps or in icy soils at the mid to high latitudes. But there is maybe some evidence for liquid water on the surface today. So these are, okay, there they go. Hopefully you can see this, but these are dark slope streaks form on crater walls in the spring and the summertime, and then they disappear in the fall. One hypothesis for how these form is that there are hygroscopic salts on the surface. Hygroscopic means that these materials adsorb water from the atmosphere and become a liquid. So then they would become a liquid and flow downslope. There are other hypotheses that don't involve any liquid water at all, so these could be formed by dry processes. The jury is still out on this one. But there is abundant evidence for liquid water on Mars 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. So I'm going to zoom into this portion of Mars. This is a topographic map where the reds, browns, and whites are high elevation. So this is a series of 3 volcanoes on the Tharsis Bulge. Blues are low elevation. For scale, this is the Valles Marineris Canyon system. It's about 3,000 miles across. And if you look at the boundary between these high elevation areas and this basin over here, you can see these huge outflow channels, these giant river channels that are, some of them are over 1,000 miles long. So a lot of liquid water must have been involved in their formation. We also see some features on the Martian surface that are similar to features that we see on Earth, and so we can use our knowledge of how they form on Earth to inform us how they formed on Mars. This is a fan or a delta deposit in Lake Baikal. These form when sediments transported from a river are deposited in a body of water, so either a lake or an ocean. And this is a gorgeous fan or delta deposit that's preserved in a crater on Mars called Eversbaldy Crater. And you can see it's got these gorgeous channels are still preserved even 3.5 billion years later. This is a river system in a drainage basin in Yemen. This is another river system in a drainage basin in the ancient highlands of Mars. So we also see, many of you noticed or noted that we see minerals that form from liquid water. This is a color image of a location called Mars Vallis. It's near one of those large outflow channels that I identified in the topographic map. And based on orbital infrared spectroscopy, so using wavelengths of light that are slightly longer than what we can see with our eyes, we can identify a variety of minerals, some of which formed in liquid water. So in red and green is evidence for clay minerals. Clay minerals require a lot of liquid water to form, and they generally form under near neutral pH, so likely relatively habitable environments. And then in blue are hydrated sulfate salts, and so those form obviously in more saline conditions. And so based on the mineralogy, we see a variety of environments preserved at Marsalis. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about Mars had all this water for 3 or 4 billion years ago, but what happened to it? And so this is a fun video sort of showing you the evolution of water on the Martian surface. So let's go back to Mars 4 billion years ago. This is what we think it would have looked like. So we think there were lakes, there were rivers, the atmosphere was likely thicker, and so there were clouds. It probably snowed, it might have rained, there were probably glaciers. It sort of looks like a little bit like the desert Southwest, maybe Nevada or Utah. Looks like actually a nice place for a vacation. But about 4 billion years ago, Mars lost its magnetic field. And the magnetic field of any planet is what protects its atmosphere from cosmic radiation. And so when Mars lost its magnetic field, it could no longer protect its atmosphere, and so much of it was eroded away from radiation coming in from space. And as that happened, much of the water that was on the surface was lost to space, and so we were left with this dry, cold, pretty desolate place that we know as Mars today. Okay, so now let's move on to what we've learned with Curiosity. There were 6 other landers and rovers before Curiosity. Viking 1 and 2, they landed in 1976. Pathfinder was the first rover. It was a tech demo that landed in 1997. Opportunity and Spirit, they landed in 2004, and Phoenix landed near the Martian Arctic in 2008. And of course, Curiosity landed in Gale Crater in August 2012. Perseverance is the next rover to land, and that will land February 2021. I realized that I forgot Insight, which is actually sort of where the O is in Curiosity. Sorry, Insight. And just to give you a sense of scale for these rovers, down here, this is Pathfinder, that first rover that went to Mars. It's about the size of a microwave. Opportunity and Spirit are about the size of a golf cart. And Curiosity and Perseverance all share this, they both share the same chassis, and they're about the size of a small SUV. So Curiosity landed in Gale Crater in August 2012. Gale Crater is an impact basin. It's about 150 kilometers or 90 miles wide. And in the center, it contains a 5-kilometer or 3 miles tall mound of layered sedimentary rock that we call Mount Sharp. And what's interesting about Mount Sharp is the lowest layers of Mount Sharp show this change in composition, suggesting that they are recording a change in environment or in climate on Mars about 3.5 billion years ago. And so if we zoom into those lowermost layers of Mount Sharp, here this is an orbital image, but I've sort of changed our perspective here, so we're looking straight down, and so the summit of Mount Sharp would be down and to the right. You can see some of these layers of lowermost Mount Sharp, and from infrared spectroscopy, we know that some of them are enriched in minerals like hematite, which is an iron 3+ oxide. Some of them are enriched in clay minerals, and others are enriched in sulfate salts. So the plan for Curiosity was to land at the base of these lowermost layers of Mount Sharp, then drive up them into younger and younger units, and use our instruments to study these rocks and sediments and determine what these ancient climates were like that are preserved in these rocks, and if they would have been habitable to microbial life. Curiosity has a variety of science instruments. I'll start up at the mast. We have cams, which is a pair of cameras that give us those beautiful images at the outcrop to horizon scale. We have ChemCam, which is a geochemical instrument. It can determine the geochemistry of a rock or a sediment up to 7 years away, so it fires a laser, creates a plasma out of that rock or sediment, and then has a series of 3 spectrometers to analyze that plasma. Out on the arm, we have another geochemical instrument called APXS. It gives us the bulk chemistry of surface targets. We also have MOLLY, which is our hand lens imager. So it gives us close-up views of rocks and sediments. We also have our sample handling system on the arm, so our drill, our scoop, our brush, and our sieve. Inside the rover, we have our 2 laboratories. We have the Sample Analysis at Mars, or SAM instrument. It can determine the volatile content of rocks and sediments. It can also look for organic molecules. And then we also have the instrument that I work on, ChemIn, which is an X-ray diffractometer for bulk mineralogy. And I'll tell you much more about how ChemIn works later in my talk. So this is our traverse from our landing site out on the plains. Across the plains, you'll see we had to go around this massive, active aeolian or wind-blown dune field before we could turn to the southeast and start climbing the lower slopes of Mount Sharp. We've driven a little over 22 kilometers in the past nearly 8 years. And so now what I want to do is just take you along the traverse and show you some of the more important outcrops that we've identified so you get an understanding of what Gale Crater was like 3.5 billion years ago. So we landed on August 5th, 2012. We used a brand new landing system called the Sky Crane. So Curiosity was way too big to land with airbags, and so this Sky Crane was a separate vehicle that just gently placed Curiosity on the surface with a series of cables. Those cables were cut, and then this spacecraft went and crash landed nearby. But this is the first MaxCam mosaic that we collected after landing, and you can see Mount Sharp beautifully tall and proud in the background, and in the foreground you can see some scour marks from those descent rockets from the Sky Crane. And actually those descent rockets did us a huge favor. They cleared off a lot of the surface sediment, revealing this beautiful bedrock, which is conglomerate. And conglomerate is a type of sedimentary rock that has relatively large particles or clasts in it that are greater than 2 millimeters in diameter. And looking a little more closely at that conglomerate, you can see some beautifully rounded pebbles in here, and actually the size and the roundedness of these pebbles suggests that these sediments were deposited in a river that was anywhere from ankle to hip deep, which is amazing. Okay, so from our landing site, we actually drove to the east. We took a little detour rather than driving to the southwest towards Mount Sharp because from orbit we saw these bright fractured rocks that we wanted to investigate. And I love this image from HiRISE, which is a camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, because you can see our landing site. You can see our rover tracks as we drove over to this confluence between these different rock types. And if you look really closely, this little white dot here is Curiosity as we descended into a place that we called Yellowknife Bay. And this is what Yellowknife Bay looks like from the ground. It's primarily made up of mudstone, which is a type of sedimentary rock that has very fine grains in it. So grains that are typically less than a few microns in diameter. So this suggests deposition in a very low energy environment, so something like a lake. We also see evidence for groundwater moving through these sediments before they lithified. You can see these raised ridges. These are actually enriched in magnesium, suggesting that the groundwaters here were also enriched in magnesium. And then we see these tiny little spherules, and these are from pores in the sediments where water was percolating through them before they lithified. And we did our first drill campaign here. We used to, we don't anymore, but we used to do 2 drill holes, 1 test drill hole that was only a few centimeters deep to make sure that we weren't going to fracture the rock. And then our full drill hole goes down about 5 to 6 centimeters. And for scale, this is about the diameter of a dime, so maybe a little over a centimeter. So it's pretty small. But we actually made a really interesting discovery before we even delivered these samples to the internal instruments. And I want to know if you guys can see it. So this is a question for you, something to put in the chat window. How is the drilled sample from beneath the surface, so these drill tailings here, how are they different from what we see on the surface? So please put your answers in the chat.
So
everyone is really excited about this on the team, by the way.
And some are right away saying the color is gray and not red, and the color changes. Someone has even indicated perhaps it has something to do with oxidation and the texture that's visible, and the color and texture seems different. We have coming in from quite a few folks. Some are wondering if it has anything to do with it being potentially metallic or weathered. And a couple of folks have even mentioned how it almost looks a little cement-like. And here someone has actually some information about, before it goes away and scrolls up too far for me, color, consistency, oxidation, texture are different below from above. And so that color immediately has jumped out, and folks have seemed to have some different thoughts on what that could be a sign or what it means in terms of the color, if that is in fact what people were so excited about. What do you say, Liz?
I think everybody's exactly right. We were so excited that these drill tailings were gray. The surface of Mars is red. We all know that. It's the red planet. But it seems like that is only just the surface veneer. And in the subsurface, it can sometimes be gray. And so this is important because it tells us, like many people were alluding to, it tells us about the composition and the mineralogy, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So good job, everybody. So, okay, so further down our traverse, we stopped at a place called the Kimberley Sandstone. This is made up of a lot of beds of sandstone that are just gently dipping towards the center of the crater. And so Mount Sharp is often up and to the left over here. And these deposits are consistent with prograding delta deposits or fan deposits, so suggesting that this is where a river entered a lake on the crater floor. We finally got to the lowermost slopes of Mount Sharp in September 2014 when we got to an outcrop that we called the Pahrump Hills. For scale, this is about 15 meters of vertical stratigraphy. We spent 5 months here, and this is our traverse that we actually did 3 separate times. Our traverse is about 100 meters in length. And these dots represent stops along our traverse where we did more complex scientific measurements at the red dot and less complex scientific measurements at the white dots. And Pahrump Hills is primarily made up of mudstone, so again, that very fine-grained sedimentary rock that suggests deposition in the lake. But we see that these mudstones are laminated. Some of these laminations are about on the order of a thickness of about 1 centimeter, and some are very thinly laminated with layer thicknesses of just about 1 millimeter. And so this suggests regular, repeated delivery of sediment to a lake. We don't exactly know what caused that regular delivery of the sediments, but on Earth this is typically a seasonal process. So you might imagine on Mars and Gale Crater, during the spring and summer when the snow melts, more sediments are delivered to the lake, forming these layers. We also see some other interesting sedimentary features. If you look carefully in the side of this rock, you can see some sort of wavy lineations or laminations. These are actually fossilized ripples from either a river environment or a wind-blown environment. We also see this really interesting target. We got really jazzed about this one too. We call this one Old Soaker. It's about 4 feet across. And so this is another question for you guys to put in the chat. Can you describe these features on the surface of the rock and what these features might provide evidence of?
And those descriptions are so important. And so we right away have contraction features, looks like lizard skin or dried up mud, rapid drying, potentially dry cracks. Looks like mud cracks, an area where perhaps water has dried up. Cracking, someone else has mentioned, from dried up, again, mud. Someone else has their cracking, which involves evaporating water or liquid. Someone else is mentioning how it could be mineral fill in mud cracks. So again, alluding to this idea of mud cracks here in Old Soaker. Someone has mentioned that this kind of reminds them of an area in, where did that go? In Death Valley. And others are mentioning potential, again, is this an erosional type of feature, dried up maybe after rain, like similar to rain drying up after a desert rain, hydrothermal mineralization with those white-colored veins perhaps, and someone even mentions salt deposit and so much more. So Liz, tell us about Old Soaker, and do scientists really describe features before they kind of decide what they are providing evidence of?
Yeah, that's a great point, Paige, is that it's important to describe the features first before you link a genetic relationship to those. So these are desiccation cracks. So like many people said, mud cracks from the subaerial desiccation of wet sediments on the surface of Mars 3.5 billion years ago. So definitely evidence of the presence of liquid water, but the drying of liquid water, perhaps along a lake margin. So very good, everybody. We also see other evidence for groundwater and wet sediments. So these little cuties on the left are concretions. They form generally in wet sediments from a seed crystal and the crystallization of minerals around that seed crystal. And these actually are enriched in nickel and sulfur, which is pretty cool. On the right, we see these little rice grain looking things. These are lenticular crystal molds or crystal pseudomorphs. Their morphology is very similar to gypsum, which is a hydrated calcium sulfate. And gypsum in this form typically forms from drying sediments at the sediment-water interface. We also see abundant calcium sulfate veins. These formed after the rocks were lithified from fluids moving through fractures in the rock. These sulfate veins are especially unique because you can see these black crystals within them. We think these are hematite, so an iron 3+ oxide. So this fluid was especially interesting because it had calcium sulfate and iron all in the fluid all at once. We also see some other interesting features. This is an example of some weird features that we don't really know what they are, but they are enriched in iron. We ended up calling them sticks. That's not what they are. But these two different features suggest that iron was mobile in groundwater in Gale Crater. Okay, so based on all of the images that I've showed you, we can come up with a cartoon or a model to explain what Gale Crater was like 3.5 billion years ago. So if you were standing on the crater floor looking up at the rim, you would have seen rivers and streams emanating from the rim, probably from the melting of snow and ice. Those rivers and streams would have deposited the conglomerates we saw at the landing site. They would have been flowing into one or maybe a series of lakes on the crater floor, and where they entered those lakes, that's where the delta deposits would have formed, like we saw at the Kimberley. And then along the lake margin, you would have had occasional drying, forming those mud cracks we saw at Old Soaker, and precipitating gypsum, like we saw in Pahrump Hills. And then while the rivers and lakes were present, and probably long after they were gone, groundwaters were moving through these rocks and sediments. So we can learn a lot more about these past aqueous or aquatic environments based on the mineralogy of these rocks. And so the instrument that we use to identify minerals and quantify them is called ChemIn, and I'm hoping, yep, there we go. So this is a video to show you how the ChemIn instrument works. We deliver either a scooped soil or a drilled rock powder to one of 27 reusable sample cells. We then transmit an X-ray beam through that sample. And of course, you cannot see X-rays, but I give you permission to have X-ray vision today. So while that X-ray beam is being transmitted through the sample, that sample is being agitated. So we get all different grain orientations, and all the grains get to come in contact with the beam. Minerals are crystalline structures, and so these X-rays then diffract off of atomic planes within the crystals. Each crystal has a distinct crystal structure, and so it has a distinct diffraction pattern. And so we can use the position and the intensity of these diffraction rings to not only identify minerals, but also quantify them in our samples. This figure on the left shows you our traverse. It's a little cockeyed from what I showed you before, where north is sort of up and to the left. But these red dots represent places where we have drilled rocks and delivered them to both ChemIn and SAM. These images are of each of the drill holes, and what I want you to appreciate is that they all have a variety of colors. So we'll see, those gray drill tailings like we saw in Yellowknife Bay. There are some beautiful red ones. Some are a little purple, but this is telling us that these samples vary in composition. Because these are actually the results from ChemIn. These are the mineral abundances for each of the ancient mudstones that we drilled in Gale Crater as we drove up Mount Sharp. And so each of these colors represents a different mineral group. And what I want you to appreciate is the variety of colors, how they change going up the mountain, and their abundances also change. I'll point out just a few of these slices of minerals. In green, these are the phyllosilicates. And so remember, these require a lot of liquid water to form, generally near neutral pH. So something that's indicative of water abundance and pH. In red is hematite, which is that iron 3+ oxide. It requires fairly oxic conditions to form, so it requires dissolved oxygen in the water column. In black is magnetite. It's a different iron oxide mineral. It's a mixed iron 2+, iron 3+, so both oxidized and reduced iron. So it requires less oxygen dissolved in the water column. In yellow, these are calcium sulfate salts, so they require more saline conditions to form. And in these purple and brown slices of pie, those are minerals that require not only saline conditions, but also very acidic conditions. So based on the mineralogy, we know that these environments in Gale Crater had differences in pH, salinity, temperature, and redox conditions. And thinking back to those gray sediments down at Yellowknife Bay, they were gray because there's abundant magnetite, which is a black mineral, and not a lot of hematite, which is a red mineral. Okay, so finishing up this part of the talk on curiosity, Gale Crater had a system of rivers, lakes, and deltas about 3.5 billion years ago. We know from curiosity that groundwater moved through the sediments before they were lithified and after they were lithified. And the mineralogy and geochemistry suggests that there were many different types of aquatic environments which would have been habitable to ancient microbial life. And these are images from Earth, but this is what we think Gale Crater might have looked like with alternating wet and dry periods. Okay, so let's move on to Perseverance in Jezreel Crater. Perseverance has the same body of Curiosity, but has different instruments, so it has different goals. Curiosity really is a mobile geologic laboratory, and the main goal of Curiosity is to identify habitable environments. Perseverance will also identify past environments capable of supporting microbial life, but it also has instruments that will allow it to seek signs of possible past microbial life in those habitable environments. It's also going to collect rock and soil samples in these little drill cores and store them on the Martian surface for later return to Earth. And it's also going to test the production of oxygen from CO2 in the Martian atmosphere. This is a little schematic showing you some of those drill cores. They're about the length of a number 2 pencil. There's going to be 37 drill cores available to put sample into, and the goal for the end of the mission is to fill 20 of these with sample for later return to Earth. The launch window for Perseverance opens July 17th at 9:15 a.m. Eastern Time. It'll land February 18th next year. The primary mission is about 1.5 Mars years, which is 3 Earth years. Perseverance has a variety of instruments, and I'll note that some of these come from international partners. There are a couple that are familiar to us on Curiosity. There is a MassCam-like instrument and a ChemCam-like instrument, but these have additional capabilities, so their new names are MassCam-Z and SuperCam. RIMFAX is a radar, so it can determine the structure of the near subsurface surrounding the rover or beneath the rover. MOXIE is that instrument that's going to test the production of oxygen from CO2 in the Martian atmosphere. And out on the arm, we have a couple of really interesting instruments. Sherlock is a UV Raman spectrometer that can identify organic molecules. And then Pixel is a geochemical instrument that can actually map the position and abundance of elements within rocks and sediments. And I think some of you asked questions about this earlier, but Perseverance is going to have an awesome tech demo, the Ingenuity helicopter, which was named very recently. It weighs about 4 pounds on Earth. This rotor is about 4 feet across, and it will spin at 2,400 revolutions per minute. It's solar powered. You can see these solar panels on the top, and it'll have 2 cameras. It'll have a black and white and a color camera. Ingenuity is located in the belly of the rover, so the plan is for after landing, Ingenuity will be dropped off on the surface. Perseverance will drive some amount of distance away from it, and the only thing that Ingenuity has to do to be successful is to fly vertically and land. The end. So if that happens, we call it a success. Yay! But hopefully that flight is incredibly successful and the engineers can plan more complex flights to collect images of the surrounding area and help us with our traverse. But this is certainly a really exciting step forward in robotic Mars exploration. For the landing of 2020 for Perseverance will use a sky crane like Curiosity did, but it has this new terrain relative navigation to shrink that landing ellipse. So what's going to happen is that the lander will take descent photos. It will compare those photos to an orbital image and will divert the lander if necessary. And so the landing ellipse for Curiosity was fairly large, 25 by 20 kilometers. The landing ellipse for Perseverance is only 7 by 9 kilometers, which is significantly smaller. Perseverance is going to land in Jezreel Crater, which is a smaller crater on the edge of this giant crater called Isidis Basin. Isidis Basin is about 3.9 billion years old. In the vicinity, we see the Syrtis Major volcanics. These are about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years old. We also see the Nili Fossae, which are fractures in the crust associated with the Isidis Basin. And from crater counting, we think that Jezreel Crater is about 3.8 billion years old. So formed on a time on Mars that we think was fairly habitable. This is a close-up view of the crater, so you can see it's a few tens of kilometers across. In these colors, these are different mineral signatures from infrared spectroscopy. But I have another question for you to put in the chat. why do you think the Mars science community decided to send Perseverance to Jezreel Crater? Are there features that you can see in or around the crater that would be interesting for scientists to investigate? So please put your answers in the chat.
And based on some of our past answers, we'll see what we do come up with. And right away, someone has put in evidence of a past delta, alluvial fan, terrain transitions that perhaps can give folks some more choices. Someone else has mentioned that there's a variety of minerals, perhaps some that are hydrated minerals that are indicated from the map that you are showing. Terrain transitions, we said that. Looks like there could be some evidence of flowing water or potentially some deposits that scientists will want to investigate. We've got quite a few answers in there that are indicating that there could be some type of flow delta or river delta or alluvial fan, a lake bed floor, different rock types that could perhaps be important to study. Someone else has mentioned, very interestingly enough, a fossilized delta and a variety of landscapes, including craters, to be able to study. And so, and some thoughts on minerals that might suggest water-rich past environments and layers, mountains, lower land areas, geological surface compositions that might be different compared to the landing site of previous landers and rovers. That seems like a really interesting point to make. And visiting Gale Crater suggests craters are a good site for research. So we've got, again, we have such a thoughtful group on the line with the different aspects that they are mentioning. They are informed, but they're bringing up some really great points, which I've tried to read off, including smooth areas that might be easier to traverse, which is an important aspect, I would think. So, Liz, what do you think now?
Well, I think, again, we have a very bright group, very informed group on the line. But yeah, so we do see evidence for liquid water here. We see this gorgeous preserved delta on the western side of the crater. There's also an eroded delta at the northern part, which is much, much harder to see. But if you look closely, you'll see also the inlet that leads to that delta. And if you look even harder, you'll see an outlet. So we think that this was an open crater lake, or that there was an open crater lake in Jezreel Crater about 3.8 billion years ago. And a lot of people notice that there are different colors here, so signifying different mineral deposits. And actually, they are different from what we see with Curiosity. There are abundant carbonates here in Jezreel Crater. Carbonates typically need near neutral to alkaline pHs, and they might have precipitated at a time when Mars had a thicker CO2-rich atmosphere. And this is just a zoom in to this western delta here, just so you can see some of these absolutely gorgeous features. And this is the notional mission scenario for Perseverance in Jezreel Crater. The plan is to land near the base of the delta, again in those smooth areas like somebody identified as being safe to traverse. Then Perseverance would investigate the delta base, followed by the delta surface, followed by the lake margin deposits. This is where those abundant carbonates are expected to be found, finally ending at the crater rim 3 Earth years later. The notional traverse is 15 kilometers, which will take probably a pretty peppy driving pace, considering Curiosity has only traversed 22 kilometers in the last 8 years. Okay, this is my last slide. So Perseverance is the first step of Mars sample return. But Mars sample return is going to be very complex and multi-staged. So the first step is to collect those samples with Perseverance and keep them on the Martian surface. The next stage, or the next mission, is to send a sample retrieval or fetch rover to collect those samples and to bring them to a rocket that will put those samples in orbit around Mars. And the third step is to send a different spacecraft to go and grab those samples that are in orbit and bring them back to Earth. NASA is working with international partners, including the European Space Agency, or ESA, to get this going. The hope is that the second stage, so the Fetch rover, will be launched in 2026. That's the hope. So you are now up to date on Curiosity, and you are prepared for Perseverance, launching in T-minus, I think, 37 days. And so I just want to say thank you very much for your attention and for your very thoughtful and fantastic answers to my questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liz, for covering so much information about these two rover missions. And I know that there are folks out there that, as we are approaching the top of the hour, if you do have to depart, we want to thank you for your participation today, and like Liz said, for your really thoughtful answers that I know Liz was looking at in that chat window as well. And I know we have a number of questions that we want to try to have Liz answer, and utilizing her expertise. So if you have questions that you want to put in the Q&A, that's the place where we can easily find them to be able to answer them. If you put them in the chat, we're probably going to lose track of them. So questions in that Q&A, and I'm also going to look at questions that came in on some of your registration forms. So again, I realize it is the top of the hour, so those of you that might need to depart, thank you again, but we're going to be on the line for another 30 minutes or so getting some answers. So thank you, Liz, for also being willing to stay on the line. So,
yeah, of course.
So one of the questions, or a set of questions, you kind of recently were talking about the helicopter on Perseverance. And so one of the questions that someone had put in was I know you mentioned successes, it flying up and then landing down, but one of the participants wanted to know, could it be used to help locate interesting targets for the rover to investigate?
That is a fantastic question, and it's actually something that I am studying using an analog mission that my husband is actually the lead of. But we have a rover and a drone that we're using in Iceland, which is another Mars analog environment, and we are testing how to use drone or helicopter images or photography to help us plan rover traverses. And we're finding that the high-resolution images taken from a drone very close to a rover can really help scientists identify features of interest to go and study. So we do really hope that the Ingenuity helicopter can do more complex flights and check out some nearby features to help the scientists plan the rover traverse. So that's a great question.
And that's a great answer. And related to that, we had someone ask is this a potential sign of the future? Would they, if this does in fact work, might they look to do this with other rovers in the future?
Yeah, I can imagine that, a paired rover helicopter would be incredibly powerful, maybe not only for robotic exploration, but, you think about humans who will go to Mars someday, and they want to, they don't want to waste their time just walking around the Martian surface looking for neat things to pop up. They could use a rover and a drone to look for really interesting sites to explore.
Awesome. So that helicopter really is kind of neat and interesting to think about. And we're going to jump from helicopters, robotic helicopters, to humans. Now, this, again, is a previous question that came in from someone's registration form. And they looked at the success of the SpaceX mission getting astronauts to the ISS. And does that at all help with the timeline for future missions to Mars, whether those are manned or unmanned missions to Mars? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it doesn't hurt. I'll say that. A successful manned mission to the ISS using commercial partners is a great demonstration of, how we can use commercial vehicles to launch not only, robots, landers, rovers, but also people. So that sort of puts this capability in our back pocket of something that we could possibly use in the future to send people to Mars.
And that will be certainly an exciting day, in this moon to Mars sort of era that we're in. We work to get one step closer, and little by little, step by step, we really look forward to getting there. So speaking of humans on Mars, someone else had asked, whether it's robots or humans, how do they sort of affect the Martian landscape or environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that my colleagues in the Mars science community have thought quite a bit about, because once people go to Mars, Mars is contaminated. We all carry microorganisms. We've got our own microbiomes, like every corner of our body. So, once we get there, Mars is essentially contaminated. It doesn't mean that, whatever we're carrying is going to survive. Actually, the Martian surface is incredibly harsh with high levels of radiation, so it's unlikely that anything would ever survive. But then we can't be sure of what we find on the Martian surface. Is that something we brought with us, or was that something that was originally there? And so that makes these samples that are coming back from Perseverance, from Mars Sample Return, incredibly important, because those might be the only surface samples that are returned from Mars before people get there and sort of contaminate it.
Very, very interesting. And, thinking about sort of contamination or life in general, I mean, you have confirmed that you have mentioned, I believe, that there is no life on Mars that has been detected up to this point, including no plant life. The rover itself is not going out there to look for any plant life because we don't expect to see anything like that. But someone has actually asked, and this comes from one of their students, if there's no life, or especially if there's no bacteria on Mars that we're aware of, what would happen to trash?
Yeah, that's a fun question that I haven't thought about before, but I think essentially in the very cold, dry Martian surface, it would be preserved forever. Yay. So I don't think it would degrade.
Okay, so something to think about as we think about human future missions. So let's go to a little bit of geology. So someone has asked, how did scientists actually determine that those surface channels and features that you see on the surface from imagery and such were from water opposed to some other liquid?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because Mars and Earth share a similar geologic history, it's really the only fluid that makes sense. We also see water ice, so we assume liquid water was also present on the Martian surface. And the features that we see are very similar to those that are formed by liquid water on Earth.
Excellent. And certainly bringing back some of those samples would give us more information and data that would allow even further investigations and solidifications of some of the thoughts that are out there. Now,
Definitely.
We had two folks that had similar questions, and one is, how did Mars lose its magnetic field? And related to that, what are the theories about why Mars lost its magnetic field?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we don't exactly know why it lost its magnetic field, but one of the theories is that it is, basically half the mass of Earth, so it is much smaller, meaning it has less internal heat, And so the way the magnetic field is formed is there is a liquid outer core spinning around a solid inner core. That creates a dynamo, which creates a magnetic field. And so we think that Mars just sort of lost that internal heat, and so that liquid outer core just stopped spinning around the solid inner core. There is also a theory that there was a massive impact that disrupted the dynamo. So two competing hypotheses.
Interesting. And I'm sure that's a very challenging question to be able to answer about a planet that's, in a sense, so far away.
Yes.
Remote sensing at its best and all that data that goes along with it.
Very true.
So here's one of our educators is wondering, so have any of the rovers or landers found really frozen water underground on the surface of Mars or underground under the surface of Mars?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think somebody noted this when we asked about how do we know that there was water on Mars. The Phoenix lander, which landed near the Martian Arctic, scooped a few centimeters deep into the soil near the Martian Arctic and did find water ice in those soils.
Ah, yes, that's right, Phoenix. And we had folks in our building that were part of the Phoenix mission as well. So all of these missions are so very exciting. And actually even, you know, the Phoenix, the lab that we have in our building is somewhat, I think, associated or related to this next question that someone is asking about the SAM instrument. So they've asked that SAM on Curiosity, they're assuming, has a limited number of sample cups and limited amounts of other consumables like solvents. Any idea about how much has been used up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think I don't know exactly how many cups they have left. They've been talking about, and they're very picky about what samples they use for their solvents. So their solvents, some of them cause a derivatization reaction with some organic molecules, so they react with some of the organic molecules, making them more easy to detect with SAM. And so they've done at least one derivatization experiment, and they're hoping to do another one soon, but we just haven't found the right sample yet. And I don't know how many cups are left. I know they can reuse cups. But everything I've heard from the SAM team does not make me think that they are especially concerned about those consumables in terms of sample cups.
Good to know, and that was a very interesting question there. Someone obviously knows a little bit about SAM. So, you know, related to, you were talking about, you know, the drill holes, and we saw in the observations being made about the different colors in some of the drill holes. So someone is actually asking, you know, how deep is that red surface layer, and does it vary from location to location?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, in some cases, it is not even a centimeter deep. In other cases, it goes as far down as our drill can go, which is about 6 centimeters. So in some cases, we see, you know, oxidation at least, you know, 6 centimeters down. In other areas, it's just really a surface veneer. And, you know, related to that, I'm going to try to read this question. Hopefully this will make sense. It seems to be related to what you were just answering. So the reddish color surface, if that comes from iron oxides, where does the iron go in the deeper, you know, grayer samples? Such a good question. It's still there. It's just not oxidized, or not as oxidized. So the red iron oxide mineral that we typically find on Mars is called hematite, Fe2O3. It is all Fe3+, so all oxidized iron. Another mineral that is black is called magnetite. That is Fe3O4, which has 2 Fe3 pluses to every 1 Fe2 plus. And so you can have just variations in the type of iron oxide mineral that is present between magnetite and hematite. Iron can also be in other minerals like olivine, which is my birthstone. If anybody else was born in August, peridot is our birthstone, which is a type of olivine, gem quality olivine. Olivine is FeMg SiO4. There are other iron-bearing minerals like pyroxene. So basically, iron can be in a variety of minerals, but typically what's controlling that red color is the presence or absence of hematite.
Very interesting. So someone has actually put in a pretty interesting question about, commanding the spacecraft and sending commands. So how long does it take to send a command message to the rover on Mars from Earth, and how long is the delay from when the rover sends data back from Mars to Earth?
Yeah, it's a great question. The lag time, I think, is typically like 30-ish minutes, maybe 15 to 30 minutes to relay information. But it depends on where Earth and Mars are with respect to one another. There are about 3 weeks every year and a half where we are in something called conjunction, where the sun is in between the Earth and Mars, and so we cannot communicate with the rover for those 3 weeks. But the way operations works is that we make either a 1, 2, or 3-day plan. Sometimes if we've got a holiday coming up, like we do for 4th of July, we will make a 4-day plan so we can have an extra day to have our barbecues and beer. But we plan all of the activities that the rover and its instruments will do over the course of those 1 to 4 days, bundle it all up, and send all of those commands at one time to execute over the next 1 to 4 days. And then we come back 1 to 4 days later, we make sure that those sequences executed properly, and we make our next plan.
So, and that, some people might have a thought that someone's literally using, in a sense, a joystick to move the rover around, but that's truly not how it works.
It is not, and it would be actually pretty dangerous with that sort of delay. You could easily drive yourself off of a cliff or get stuck on a big pointy rock before you even knew it.
And in those planning stages, Liz, are there oftentimes back and forths or potential arguments about, no, I think we should go here, or no, I think we should go there, and how does that get worked out?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are strategic and tactical planning groups. So in terms of the strategic planning groups, they are planning activities a few weeks out to maybe even a few months or even a few years out. So we have people on the science team and engineers who are working on a drive path that is, 5 kilometers from where we are today. The tactical team will plan the activities for that day or for those 4 days, whatever we're planning. And so really the science team has about an hour and a half each planning day morning to figure out what activities they want to do. And they do take a list of activities that we need to get done from the strategic team and sort of like mark those off. But there is opportunity for observations that aren't on that list, especially if we find something that sometimes we call them a silver bullet, something that we didn't expect to find, that we want to use resources to investigate.
Well, it must be so very exciting. And even though it's been years that this rover has been roving on Mars, it never gets old. And there's always such amazing things. Yes.
Totally agree. Yes.
So one of our participants, she has in her question, thinking like a second grader. So the geology of Mars and the minerals found there are the same as what we find on Earth. But have we located anything completely sort of unfamiliar to Earth's geology?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Okay, thinking like a second grader. So the minerals that we find on Mars nothing is new, but sometimes the abundances of certain minerals is not what we expected, and there are certainly there's a greater diversity of minerals on Earth than what we have found on Mars, at least so far. So on Mars, we see a lot of mafic minerals, meaning they have a lot of iron and magnesium. We see a lot of rocks that are similar to what we find in Hawaii. So those dark basaltic fluid lavas is what's primarily found on Mars. On Earth, we find those rocks in some spots, but they're not all that abundant. So that's why some of these Mars analog sites are really, really special. Because there was no plate tectonics on Mars, there was no continental crust, so things like granite, minerals like potassium feldspar and quartz are pretty rare on Mars. We do see some in Gale Crater, but not a lot. So I would say that there aren't any different minerals that we see on Mars, but sort of the proportion of minerals that we see on Mars versus Earth is different.
And that's a great way to put it. Those proportions being different. Hopefully that can be made sense to a second grader. But that's a great question. And thank you so much, Liz, for even trying to think like a second grader. It's been a little while that any of us have been a second grader, but the thought process of different folks out there, to me, is just so intriguing. And even the questions that come to mind from people based on what they know, their own background knowledge. And so the questions are fascinating, and the way you're finding ways to answer them is absolutely terrific. So thank you. So here's another question, and you briefly touched on the cache system for Perseverance. So how are the sites to deposit the caches of the sample tubes chosen? Any idea how many cache sites there'll be, and how will future rovers navigate to those areas?
Yeah, that is such a good question, and I don't know that I can answer it completely, because this is like an ever-changing answer that, we've all been hearing from NASA. So at what point they were going to drop those tubes on the surface, sort of like a little nest of tubes for a later rover to come and fetch. I think the latest now is that Perseverance is going to hang on to those tubes, and so they will be located sort of in the front of the body of the rover. Then a fetch rover will come and grab those tubes from the front and take them with them. So all the fetch rover has to do is find Perseverance. Of course, that means Perseverance has to end up in a spot that will be easy for a little fetch rover to find.
Yeah, it looks like we had a couple of questions related to that, and that is really sort of an interesting aspect of this. And I know so many folks have been so excited about bringing samples from Mars back to Earth. And as you mentioned, we do have some meteorites from Mars, but knowing the location of where these samples have come from will be really, really powerful. So here's let's see. As I'm looking through the chat or the Q&A, there's half questions and half chat. So I'm trying to decipher where is the question and where are people sort of putting in their answers to your questions. But I think I just found another one. And so here's the question. So what might be some examples of possible evidence of past microbial life that the rover will be looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you know sort of what stromatolites are, so layered bacterial mats is, a type of, organism that we could detect with Perseverance. And so we could use things like Sherlock, which is UV Raman spectrometer to identify organic molecules, and then we could use the Pixel geochemical instrument to, map the location of different elements within those, layers. So I think, if we ever found a stromatolite on Mars, I think that would be like the greatest thing that we could ever find. But I think that's probably the best example of the type of past microbial life that we could find evidence for.
So for those of you out there watching and listening to Liz, I don't think she's excited at all about this, or
I'm pretty excited about this, Paige.
And hopefully people can really tell, because, that's so catchy and it's so great, to think about the power and the excitement of science. And this is what makes, the jobs that someone can find, whether you're a person like Liz who has found your passion, or a student out there that's trying to find their passion. If you get to do what you love, you never work a day in your life.
It's so true.
So here's a question, and I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but do you know how the drone is powered?
Yes, it is solar powered. So there are solar panels on the top of Ingenuity.
Well, can't wait to see if that technology demonstration works. That should be pretty fun and pretty exciting. Here's another question, and this is kind of an interesting one related to sort of time frames. You mentioned, Mars 3.5 billion years ago and this sort of evolution through time. How is a timeline like that determined?
Oh, such a good question. So I think I saw that question show up, do we use carbon dating, or what is the mechanism for, identifying those time periods? And what we use are crater counts. So the thought is that the older the surface, the more cratered it is. And so we have a sort of curve of size and abundance of craters over time that we have compared, that we've gotten from the moon, because we do have samples from the moon that we know ages of. And so we compare that to other terrestrial planets, assuming it is similar. And so that's how we get these ages of on the Martian surface.
Awesome. So here's one related to crewed missions to Mars, or even to the moon. Is there a way to protect folks and humans from solar radiation?
I think that is, one of the biggest things that we have to figure out before we can send people. As the person who asked the question noted, radiation is a big issue. It is very intense in deep space. I'm not sure if we know how to shield people from that yet. We also don't know, what are the effects of being in deep space for a long time. We have people on the ISS that have been up there that go up for months, sometimes over a year. But the thing about ISS is it's only 250 miles from Earth, and they can see Earth the whole time. How are people's brains going to react to being so far from Earth that it looks like a star?
Yeah, that's
for like 3 years.
Yeah, that's so very interesting. I mean, you think sometimes, people go on a trip away from home and they get a little homesick, and but they still know home is sort of right there. But yeah, when you can't see it, or all you're looking at, is kind of this star from the surface of Mars that happens to be the Earth, those effects and being prepared for that is something that's certainly really important to think about. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, Liz, if you had a chance to go to Mars in an upcoming mission as a human explorer, would you go?
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh my gosh. I've been thinking about Mars for so long. And I would love to go walk around on the surface, collect samples, analyze those samples, see if, we're right about some of those hypotheses that we had about Mars and the types of minerals that are present. Oh my gosh, I would go in a heartbeat.
And I'm sure that there's lots of other folks that would have that same answer. So, so very interesting to think. Robotic exploration is one thing, human exploration, personal exploration. It's also very exciting. So here's a really interesting question about sort of safety and contamination. And this individual wants to know what kinds of precautions will be taken to ensure that if samples are brought back to Earth from Mars, that there won't be that Earth won't be contaminated with any type of Martian-like bacteria or any other kind of harmful substance or potentially harmful.
Yeah. A great question. So there is a whole group of people who deal with this topic. It's called planetary protection. It's not only protecting us from whatever might be on Mars, but it's protecting Mars from stuff that we might bring to Mars from Earth. But coming back, those samples will be opened in a very special room under a special chamber and not be, people will not be exposed to the samples until they're deemed safe. So I imagine pieces of these samples will be analyzed with geochemical measurements, mineralogical measurements. These samples will probably be also put under electron microscopes to see if there are any microorganisms in those samples. So they will be thoroughly characterized through what we call a preliminary examination before they're released to scientists that are part of the Mars community.
And speaking even of the sample collection itself, do we take precautions here on Earth before we send the spacecraft to Mars to make sure we're not contaminating the surface, or even that the samples that are collected are not contaminated?
Yeah, good question, Paige. So there is a rigorous cleaning process that the rover and all the instruments go through. You might see the rover being prepared in one of these, giant clean rooms where people are in these bunny suits with masks and gloves so that the rover is not exposed to, any human microorganisms that it might take up to Mars. That being said, I think it is nearly impossible to be 100% clean. So it is nearly certain that we will take some amount, very, very, very small amount of, microorganisms up to Mars with us.
Yeah, and that process and what those folks do that work on, buttoning up the whole spacecraft before it goes, there are very stringent protocols put in place because we don't want to, we want to detect if there's any sort of items on Mars that may be of interest to us that potentially could help build the story, and we don't want to have Earth's story to be a part of that. So a lot of hard work goes into those missions. And Liz, can you tell us one more time again, what is the launch window for Mars Perseverance rover?
Yeah, it opens July 17th, 9:15 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
Awesome. So for those of you that, if you might have watched the Crew Dragon launch, the next exciting launch that will be with a robotic spacecraft Perseverance, we're really looking forward to that. And Liz will have a more data to be able to look at and see and get excited about, and in addition to what happens with Curiosity as she continues on her journey. So I do see it is about 30 minutes past the top of the hour, and I think I've gotten through, as I've tried to sort through and find the questions in the Q&A area, I think I've gotten through a good portion of them. If I did miss a question that you might have submitted, I do apologize, but there were some repeats out there and some really great questions and, of course, some great answers. But with that, since it is about half past the top of the hour, for those of you still on the line, thank you so much for sticking around and hearing and watching Liz give us some amazing answers, and just to see that excitement, I think, in this young scientist's eyes and face. You can tell that she so loves what she does, and I hope that that catches on to all of you and those audiences that you reach out to. So as we bring this to a close, Liz, any closing remarks for our diverse set of participants from all over the world?
Oh my gosh, this might be the best group that I've ever spoken to. You guys had such great questions and such thoughtful answers. I was totally blown away. So I just really appreciate your attention. Thank you so much.
Well, great. And we appreciate you, Liz. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge, your passion, and your career path in NASA. It's great for everyone to be able to know that as well. So with that, at half past the hour, we will bring this to a close. Again, thank you, everyone, for joining us. So thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, everyone else. Have a great day, and go Perseverance. We'll be watching.
Woo! Yeah, 37 days. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.